Our panelists today are Mara Tam, who is the Director of Government Affairs at HackerOne, Vincenzo Aioso, who is the CEO of Hyperplane, Jeff Moss, who is the founder of DEF CON and Black Hat, and is now part of DHS. So he'll come to us slightly schizophrenic because he's got two hats to wear, the hacker hat and the government hat. And Randy Wheeler, who is, Randy, where are you? There you are. Director of the IT Controls Division at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She's been there for 30 years, so she knows all of the inside dirt. So we should drain her of all the information she has. And our moderator today is Greg Conti, who has been a speaker here many times. I'm sure you've heard some of his fabulous talks. And he is still a professor at West Point, as well as many other things. So let's give them the stage and see what we can learn. Thank you.
So thanks for coming and welcome to You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet. New paradigms for policy, regulation, and community engagement. Everyone's been introduced. I will, in absentia, mention Mudge was supposed to moderate this, but he had a conflict at the last minute that he couldn't get out of. So we've included him and the rest of Loft in their famous 1998 congressional testimony. So he's here in spirit with us. But before we get started, you can't talk about anything about government without a good disclaimer. And so I think it's important to emphasize that everyone's views expressed on this panel are their own. They don't reflect the official opinion of their employers or their governments. You have to mention that. So why this panel? Policymakers possess great power. And with the stroke of a pen, they can make parts of what we do, all of what we do, things we've created, illegal. Or they can help enable what we do. And it's great power, and informed policy making and legislative bodies are incredibly powerful things. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. And as you may have noticed from reading the headlines, the policy and regulatory landscape is expanding and shifting, and stories that would never have made the front page in the past are now front page news, and there's legislation percolating in various lawmaking bodies that can have a tremendous impact on what we do, both professionally and personally. You've seen it in cryptography, backdoors, information sharing, exploits. So given these high stakes, how should the information security engage government, and how should government engage the information security community? Acknowledging that neither one is a monolithic organization, there are no necessarily card-carrying members of the information security community. But how should those two loosely defined organizations interact? There are many potential pitfalls, but there are many promising solutions, and the panel we have here today has tremendous experience in this space. And the quote here by Dan Geer, I think, sums it up best. Every speaker, every writer, every practitioner in the field of cybersecurity has wished that this topic, and us with it, were taken seriously, has gotten their wish. We and the cybersecurity issue have never been more at the forefront of policy, and you ain't seen nothing yet. Sometimes you get what you wish for. So with that, I'd like to go down through each of our panelists and ask them to provide brief introductory remarks, answering the questions of who am I, what am I doing, and why am I doing it? Who am I, what am I doing, why am I doing it? So, Jeff.
Okay, so I'm Jeff Moss. What am I doing? So in this context, I found I was acting sort of as a facilitator, running around, trying to make connections, trying to raise awareness. And Sandy alluded to it a little bit. I'm on this advisory council for DHS, the secretary of DHS. And so because of that, you end up getting this status called a special governmental employee. So I'm an SGE, which means I'm a government employee, but they don't pay me. So I only get my expenses covered if I'm actually at a DHS advisory meeting. Otherwise, it's all free labor. But because of that, you get other things like a clearance, and you get to talk to anybody you want to, pretty much. And so pretty soon you end up you're interested in the subject, so you go and you talk to people to find out what's going on. And then you quickly realize that what you learn, you can't really tell your friends. So you've just sort of self-limited your usefulness, because you'll see people in the community debating something, and you might know what's really going on or close to what's going on, and you can't really tell them. And so it's been really illuminating, because now for my personal edification, it's like, oh, this is how the sausage is made, right? This is how and this is probably what's going to happen down the road. But I can't really say that, and it becomes really frustrating. So when people say, well, if you get involved, you need to get close to the problem. Right? If you're not helping, you're part of the problem. So here I am trying to help, and it turns out it somewhat is limiting sometimes. And so I'm just working my way through that problem. And then what was the third question?
Why are you doing it?
Why am I doing it? I've got nothing better to do. Yeah.
Randy.
So I'm Randy Wheeler, and I'm the Director of the Information Technology Controls Division and the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. My division is responsible for export licensing of computers, communications, and information security products that are controlled on the Commerce Control List as part of the Export Administration regulations. We work with Departments of Defense, State, and Homeland Security, both on developing the regulations, the licensing requirements for the commodities, software, and technology that are subject to license requirements, and within the Department of Defense, because of the information security and encryption, we work particularly closely with the National Security Agency. We do develop the regulations, and we also implement those regulations by processing and issuing the licenses. And most of what we do, you're not going to be surprised, in our division is in the information security encryption side. And most recently, we've been dealing with the rulemaking on intrusion software that was agreed at the Wassenaar Arrangement. The Wassenaar Arrangement is a multilateral organization that establishes a common control list among the 41 member countries, and we implement those as national security controls on our Commerce Control List. And in particular, the proposed rulemaking, since even before the rulemaking was published, the proposed rule was published last May, has been a big education opportunity for me, because we don't usually do proposed rulemakings. We don't usually do notice and comment, which I misinformed Mara. It's not a formal rulemaking process. It's actually called an informal rulemaking process, where we request public comment and then address those comments in the next version of the rule, and eventually perhaps a final rule. And it has been a very large learning experience for me in the last year as we try to bring export controls into the 21st century in this fast-moving area.
Okay, great, thank you. Mara?
I'm Mara Tam. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at HackerOne. I provide a translation service, basically, between export control and information security. Since May, most of what I've done has been hunting down stakeholders in these rules that maybe don't know that they are affected, and trying to gather all the relevant people together, and with Vincenzo have actually drafted amendments to Wassenaar and are attempting to get support behind those.
And why do you do it?
Because why? I mean, I would like to see information security survive as both an industry and a practice, so...
My name is Vincenzo Iozzo. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Hyperlane, but that has about nothing to do with why I'm here and what I do. So I'm essentially here as the token panelist, meaning I'm both the closest to a researcher you would get on this panel, and also I'm the token foreigner. So what I do is be on one side of the translation process that Mara provides, and also try to talk with the few people, especially in Europe, that are willing to talk about Wassenaar and policy. Why I do it? It started because somebody was wrong on the internet. The problem is that somebody invited us to the European Parliament in Brussels, and then it felt weird to back off. So that's partially why I'm doing it. The other reason is because I think that now this has changed significantly, but when we started working on this, very few researchers or like practitioners had any interest in this process, and I think this process is somewhat dangerous and at the same time important for people like us.
Okay, great, good point. We ignore this. We ignore policy at our peril. So I'd like to just start off with an open question to the panel, and we'll get to audience questions at the end, but we've got some kind of initial discussion set up right now. What would you say is the current state of the relationship between the information security community and government officials, not in general, but in the context of policy? So the relationship between the two communities in the context of policy, and which way is it trending?
I'll say something on that. But you're taking something off my list of notes. I was going to bring this up later. What I've realized, or what I've observed, is there's policy people that are trying to quote-unquote get smart on cyber, and they're desperate for how to do that. And I realize we don't offer them any really good tools. So they're trying to take SANS classes. They're trying to watch things on YouTube. They're reading Schneier's book. Anything they can do, they're kind of trying to do, but they don't know what the roadmap is, and they really don't need to reconfigure a router. And so we don't have a good way of sort of onboarding the policy folks or C-suite folks or board people to kind of understand our language. And the same exact thing is true in reverse. And so I've watched at unnamed locations initiatives where they'll have a bunch of really, actually really smart cyber guys and try to advise policy and watch that for a year. And then later on you talk to the policy people and you're like, how did that work out? And they're like, man, they did some great technical stuff. Their technical stuff was great. They fixed all these problems for this. It's like, okay, how did the policy work out? So we had them involved 4 times. All the recommendations 4 times are terrible. They're not involved in policy anymore. It's like, well, that didn't work. That wasn't supposed to happen. And so in these experiments, it quickly realizes that there needs to be a better way to bridge the gap. So I say both sides are willing now. People are trying, but there's not a real good process for either side to figure out how to work.
So that's a really good point. What I'd like to do to draw the panel and the audience is probably more at the end of the discussion today is what are potential solutions, right? So how do we bridge that divide? There are things we can do and that have worked, and how do we? What are those? What can we suggest to folks to do? Okay, anyone else who wanted to talk, like which getting better, worse, not maybe?
So the state of that relationship is interesting because it is changing very quickly, but mostly what I've observed is that information security tends to engage on an as-needed basis. It tends to sort of do a surgical strike and then disappear. So people show up, they talk, or they yell. There was a lot of shouting in the comments that were submitted on the Wassenaar rule, and then nothing. Generally speaking, it's fade out and nobody reappears until the next crisis. So we are seeing somewhat more sustained engagement on this issue, possibly because Wassenaar is a very slow-moving process. So I'm hopeful that maybe that trend will continue in other areas because that is quite desperately what we need.
Now, do you think it's because technologists largely like working with technology, and they just hope this problem goes away on its own, and only when they're really, really angry and riled up that they actually engage? Or what's your sense of that?
I think that to a certain extent, some people view regulatory and policy intervention as anomalous, as something that is exceptional. And so the engagement ends up being, on this case-by-case basis. And I have to say at this point it's wishful thinking to, consider this exceptional or extraordinary. It's not going away.
Good. So I think the earlier discussions we talked about, you've heard the phrases translation, we heard the discussion of clearances, and the ability just to speak amongst our peers. I think a lot of this boils down to communication problems. Like you have two different tribes who are, I think, willing to come to the table and have a discussion. But what are some of the communication issues that you've encountered, and how can those be overcome?
So I think there is, first of all, what I would call a representation problem, meaning that it's not that policymakers are not willing to engage with technical people, it's just I suppose, community doesn't have representatives that can be easily tapped to talk to about these issues. So what happens is that they will talk to whoever is going to represent, in the US case, could be Raytheon, Google, and so on and so forth. In the European case, might be BAE or somebody else. And so what happens is that there is that first problem that we have as a community. And we're probably in the process of fixing that. Even if we're able to overcome that, the translation problem that you were mentioning, I think is a lack of experience type of issue, right? We don't have, as practitioners, we don't have any experience dealing with not just the language, but also the implied meaning, meaning that every time I've dealt with policymakers or politicians, it's always been like 3 layers of understanding.
Yeah,
the actual miscommunication, the policy goals, and then the political ulterior motives. And we're just not good at that as technical people.
Jeff,
No, I was just going to say it's true. It's a total language thing. I remember I was talking to someone, and they were at one of the World Internet Congresses, and he said, yeah, and then I had a really good intervention, and I was like, you had an intervention? Like what? There was somebody who's an alcoholic, and you had to bring them off to the... They're like, no, I asked a question. It's like, oh, okay. So an intervention in an international forum is essentially when you raise your hand, a 1-finger intervention, a 2-finger intervention, or it's like you have a completely different language just for the way you have conversations. And so to an outsider, I thought you were busy rescuing someone. And to the insiders, he was having a normal conversation. So just to even get your foot in the door, you have to understand the language.
Yeah, I would say that I encountered that there's they typically have folks around a round table, and they give you little name cards. And I was giving a talk, and someone put their name card on the end, and I looked at that and said, "Oh, that's odd. I wonder why that gentleman has his name card up in it." Only to realize that is one of their signals.
That's how you cue your questions.
Yeah, that's one of their signals that they have a question, and it's this entirely different world. And I'm sure if they came to ShmooCon, they would be equally befuddled on how the world works.
Great.
Yes,
Yeah.
please do.
Okay, thanks. Well, I would just like to say in the context of this current rulemaking that we've been in the middle of, that I have not noticed any reticence in people coming in and talking to us. And I think that is absolutely great, and I really appreciate everybody's willingness to spend time and resources on coming to talk to us because we want to do a correct cost-benefit analysis, and we want to understand the issues. I think that there is an awareness issue, and I don't know how to resolve that. We started getting the comments when we issued the proposed rulemaking, but there was this Wassenaar language out there for a year and a half before the rulemaking was even, the proposed rule was published. And in October, before we published the proposed rule, Dr. Sergei Bratas from Dartmouth had published an article about the Wassenaar language, and that did come to us with a comment on a completely different rule. And I asked Dr. Bratas how he had become aware of the Wassenaar language, and he said he couldn't quite remember how it had come to his attention, but he found it was of great concern. But I don't know how you overcome that initial hurdle of getting people to be aware of something that's coming down the road. And
Twitter.
You mentioned the weight of the rules. I mean, all comments.
That's a good point. So Jeff's question was how did you weight the comments? Because you probably got a lot of feedback from a wide variety of sources. How did you deal with that? Because I think that's illustrative of other similar questions. And how do you structure yours so your feedback might provide a higher impact?
so it helps if you've read the rule and actually are responsive to the rule and the provisions of it. We did get a lot of initial comments that were not terribly informed about what the rule provided, but we also, in fairness, realized that there was a lot of difference of understanding of some of the terms in the rule that we quickly addressed. Certainly all comments that address the impact of the rule and its effect are taken into consideration, and if and when a final rule is written, it will include a summary of all the comments and whether we agree with the comments or not and why, and then proceed with either another proposed rulemaking or a final rule.
So it seems to me that there's a potential for, well, obviously politics to come into play, and for various organizations lobbying, or individuals and organizations lobbying the governments to have some change. They may be doing it for honest broker type reasons, or they have their own incentives. Is it fair to characterize that maybe in the government that there's probably like a political layer, the political appointees, the people that change with administration, then that there's a long-term cadre of government employees that are just professional government employees, and they move through multiple administrations and are more concerned less with the politics and more with just the long term? Is that a fair statement? Okay. Good. I think that's an important aspect. All right. So what I'd like to do is ask each panelist, if they can, to provide a success story or a failure of information security, community, and government interaction in terms of, ideally, policy. So an engagement, and was a success or a failure. And you could have been a part of it, or you could have just seen it play out and cringed or cheered. So start.
Well, so the fact that we're here, I think, is partially a success, but the more direct story is the one I was mentioning before about somebody being wrong on the internet. So what happened, the details of that were that a member of the European Parliament had tweeted something about the proposed implementation of the dual-use regulation in Europe. And the language was pretty terrible, so a bunch of us tweeted back at her saying, look, your language is terrible. Are you willing to talk about it? So she was actually willing to talk about it, so we did a couple of events, and I think positive end result was that the final proposal she submitted to the European Commission was actually significantly better than what she initially had. It was still following her sort of like line of reasoning, but it was a lot more precise from a technical standpoint, and it included a lot of the recommendation we made to her. Now, just to be clear on the significance of this, the European Union is a weird structure whereby the individual nations elect people to the European Parliament, and then the European Parliament selects bureaucrats to work for the European Commission. The way laws are drafted is that the Parliament asks the Commission to draft some kind of regulation on something, and then that piece of legislation needs to be approved by the European Parliament. So it's somewhat significant that we managed to get one European Parliament member to actually submit a proposal or at least comments that made a lot more sense than what was out there.
So I guess my example has two parts, and I know that Randy might want to talk about this a little bit more, but the failure, I think, was the fact that information security was effectively absent from the initial rulemaking process for Wassenaar. Assistant Secretary Wolf, Randy's lovely boss, in a hearing earlier this week was very polite about the fact when he was badgered with questions by the congressional committees before him about why industry had not been sufficiently consulted on these rules, why they got them so wrong, why the implications were so misunderstood. The thought was that a very narrow rule was being crafted, and it turned out to be incredibly wide-reaching. And Assistant Secretary Wolf sort of, very delicately skirted the fact that at the time technical advisory committees were meeting and weighing in on the Wassenaar language, there were virtually no people from information security on there. I think there was one that had any connection to industry. And, that just can't happen. We can't end up fixing things after they're broken. It would be far easier if we had been in those tacks and been able to be in front of it. This story may not have a tragic ending, which I'll probably leave Randy to talk about. But, I think in terms of recent profound failures, that is a pretty big one.
Thanks, Randy.
Well, I'm hoping to put this proposed rulemaking in the success column, as Mara pointed out, and again she referred to that awareness issue, and I think that it is a particular problem in this situation because of the fast-moving pace of the information security world, and the fact that, for example, the vulnerability exchanges have started up within the last 2 years. They didn't exist perhaps at the time that the Wassenaar language was being negotiated, etc., and it's really hard to keep up. So I think that is an issue that we need to again have that awareness, and it should be at the beginning step of a process, certainly, and I hope that will continue now that we have a lot of names and organizations to call on in the future. Thanks.
And I'll just echo what Vincenzo said, which is a lot of these people are completely open to your feedback. They might not do anything with it, but you can at least talk to them. And one representative from the U.S. was at DEF CON, and we were talking, and he was asking for advice on something. And I said, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could do. One, for example, in the .gov space, actually the ccTLD.gov, through GSA purchasing regulations, has to provide name resolution services within the United States. So if Anonymous is, say, attacking FBI.gov, all that traffic comes inbound over the fiber, transatlantic, Pacific, hits the U.S. before you can even mitigate it. Well, if you push your CC name servers out into other countries, like, say, everybody else in the world, you can absorb that attack traffic elsewhere, right? Why let it come in? Well, we're making ourselves less resilient just because of a purchasing regime, right, that's probably was created 50 years ago. And so he's like, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. Well, a week later, he's doing an interview, and he mentions that. And I was like, perfect, right? You want to start influencing their thought process and solutions. And something as simple as changing the location of your name servers actually shows that he cares about cyber, he's interested, he's trying to engage. And you need to kind of almost come ready-made with a solution for some of the representatives, because they have to be an expert on everything at a moment's notice. And so the more work you can do for them, and the more thinking through, here's the pros of this idea, here's the cons. You don't want to ever cover up the cons. They know everything's a balance. So if you can provide that for them, like, you're now their friend, and then you might get invited back.
Can I say another
Yes,
thing
please.
about it? So about awareness, I think another important thing that we should probably talk about here is the fact that the information security community or industry, however you want to call it, is very diverse in views. So what is actually important to do is to have some kind of clustering algorithm that allows you to get as close as possible to the Mara-like individual. Because while it's true that there is, generally speaking, an awareness issue, I would also argue that for the vast majority of technical people, it should be that way. Like, the vast majority of technical people should not have to worry about what BIS or equivalent as published in the past 5 days. So what we need as an industry is to find, again, more people like Mara and actually pay for their salaries and so on and so forth, so that based on, like Katie is doing, and essentially have the different views clustered around people that have the knowledge and ability both to keep up with what policymakers are doing and also to be able to interface with them. I think those two things are really important.
Would you say the same is true on the government side, that there are many diverse views, polarized views on matters that are equally frustrating?
Yeah, I mean, again, my limited experience with all of this is that there are so many different views within both, and this applies both to the US and Europe, and I assume every other government. So, like, another important issue there is that what you tell to commerce doesn't necessarily work with state or doesn't necessarily work with the DoD. And again, I'm using the American part of this, but the same applies to essentially every other nation. So I think what would be really useful on the government end is to have some kind of map that also explains that, and I mean, I have a practical example to this, right? So for the longest time, a lot of people thought that, for instance, Wassenaar was about human rights. It took a long time to figure out that for the vast majority of the stakeholders involved, it had nothing to do with human rights. But essentially that changed a lot the type of conversation we had, especially in the beginning. And so I think that type of work on the government side would actually be extremely useful for people in the industry or community.
All right, thanks, very helpful. Okay, so perhaps the most important question I think we can ask of the panelists today, and we're hearing bits and pieces of it come out, are what are solutions that we can do? What are some of the best practices and means of engagement? We're hearing things like you have middle-of-the-road people who speak the languages of both tribes, for example. So I'd like to go down and delve into our panelists' expertise on what are things that work. And I'd ask not just one, but as an instructor, I learned that you challenge people to come up with like 3 things, or 4 or 5 or 10, and then they sit there. They might not get 10, but they'll get 8. And so I'll ask for 3 ideas each from the panelists, and if you need a pass, we can rotate back through. And I would also say that I think Jeff raised a really important point. The buzzword is actionable solutions. Like if you go to a senior leader and they're like, the world's on fire, this thing's going to explode, and flux capacitors are going to be inverted, and DNS traffic's going to flow into a black hole. And they don't know what you're talking about. But if you go there and you present them a thing that they can actually implement and do, and if there's a saying for staff officers, if you can bring it to the level of a signature on a memorandum, you can probably get the signature pretty easy. If you involve the boss in your decision making, then you run more risk. So that idea of solutions that can actually be implemented, often starting with the low-hanging fruit, the ones that aren't controversial, can be one start. So with that, I'll say, Jeff, ideas for solution, like how? What type of solutions?
Yeah. So if you want to, there's like a whole spectrum, right? If you want to get involved on just the weekend, or do you want to turn in tomorrow, and because it's really a passion. And so when I was at ICANN, we have these public comment periods all the time. As a multi-stakeholder model representing the entire internet, it was really important for us to get feedback. So sort of like your comment period, we ran comment periods all the time at ICANN, and it was super frustrating because we could not get very representative feedback. I mean, there were people who are legendary that provided feedback on every proposal, had never come to a meeting. We don't know what the person looked like. Could have been a robot. But all we knew is no matter any time there's a comment period, there's this one user identity that always commented. And it turned out by just showing up, people actually really cared what that one user identity said, because that person was really vested and cared. So I'd say when the comment period opened for Wassenaar, it's almost like you can't win if you don't show up. So at least provide a comment. That might not be the most informed comment, but provide comments, because like I think one of the comments that came out of DOC was, we've got the most number of comments of any process on Wassenaar. That tells them something. So, I follow like the IETF and IANA and ICANN and a couple of the internet-y things that I care about, and they're constantly announcing periods of comment. And so I'll go and I'll check them out. So that's an easy thing. The other thing is in the role at DHS, you're exactly right. Every tasking we get has to be actionable for the secretary, something the secretary can do and can do within a year, maybe 2, but you can't make it a 3-year thing. And it's somewhat limiting, because you're like, well, if they coordinated with Treasury and then they coordinated with the DOD, then you could do this awesome thing. Like, yeah, but you can't control those 2 other entities, so it has to be totally wholly owned within, right? And so when you're constrained like that, it's also somewhat liberating, because now you know the rules of the game, and you no longer have these externalities. It's like all the pieces that could possibly be used to solve the problem are here. We just have to figure out how to put it together. So I'd say focus on those 2 things, right? And the other thing I see people is overreach all the time. Every task force that I'm on, people want to boil the ocean and solve all the problems. It's like, we're not going to get the next more important tasking if we can't even solve this current one. So I think actually aim low in what you, like, pick something and do it well. Don't try to pick 10 things to show your range of flexibility and how awesome you are. Like, do a couple things really well.
In government, it's all about legal authorities to take action, your span of control of given leaders, and resources. And if you demonstrate success, more resources will flow your way. If you try to take on 10 things badly, am I hearing that that won't be viewed as a success? But if you get some quick wins.
Well, and so what's happening, like you mentioned, Dan Geer, what happens is you're like, finally, I'm in the room, I'm on this task force. I don't know if I'll ever be on another task force ever again, so I've got to make the most of this opportunity. And then all of a sudden they're off to the races and they're trying to fix everything all at once with their one shot. And it's like, no, if you do well, people know that you did well, you're a great contributor, you'll be invited back. But you can't try to do it all in your first audition.
I've seen senior leaders that'll have like their list of things they want to do this year, and it's usually 3 to 5 things, right? And that's like their strategic.
And sorry to be dominating the conversation, but exactly, they'll say, if you were in government, what would be your one thing?
Yes.
You're like, one? No, like, well, actually not the one thing you want to get done. What's your one idea? It's like, well, I've got 10 ideas. Like, that's great. Pick one. Because you probably could do 1. You can't do 5.
Well, I think if you look at Mudge as an example, he went in and said, I want to speed up the acquisition process, engage the hacker community, came up with Cyber Fast Track. That was his thing. And it was very painful and a lot of work, but he made that happen. And I think I would say the thing I see him doing now is that Cyber Underwriters Laboratory Initiative, that's one thing he can focus on.
Right.
So, Randy.
I'd like to look at it from the perspective of somebody who is actually implementing and running a regulatory program, keeping aside the proposed rulemaking. We have an ongoing licensing process, and we do depend on the exporters who have to come in and file reports or registrations or license applications and so forth to let us know what's painful, what's not, how we can do things better, and we try to keep as open a avenue of communication with them as possible, with emails, with phone calls, keeping contact information on the website, etc. And I like to think that we are responsive to essentially our constituency in the ongoing implementation of the regulations. So that's a different, a lower level, second floor, not seventh floor, look at the issue. But that is my day-to-day work generally in terms of trying to keep a regulatory process going.
So I would say that as sort of a link for the three things that I have, the maxim on both sides, whether you are agitating for intervention or whether you are the regulator or policymaker, should be to do no harm. And it is really easy to demand that somebody do something, but if you don't have that map, if you don't understand all of the implications of the thing that you are asking for, then stop and come back when you do. So more specifically, ask questions. When you engage with policy and regulatory people, try to understand what their stake in this is. Try to understand their assumptions, but you don't see a lot of asking questions when you see industry engagement. You see a lot of Randy sitting there being yelled at. And, you know, some of the best progress that we've made in this entire process has been a result of asking the right questions and suddenly putting the pieces together for what a motivation was or what an underlying assumption for an action was. And you don't get there if you don't ask. Echoing Jeff's point, find the workable solution. Don't try to do everything at one time. If you've been invited to contribute to a thing, contribute to that thing. And if you've got a pet project, just hang on. You'll get your chance. Make sure people know how to find you. That's a really good one. It's great if you've got one friend in government or who does this kind of thing, but make sure that people know that you're available. If you want to be participating in this process, it's very easy to say, I am here, I am friendly, and I am ready to help, and people will come to you. People are crying for that kind of help right now, so there will be knocks at your door. And if you aren't the right person for something, pass, or bring the right person with you.
So I'll try to go into very specific details. First, prefer written form over anything that it's like spoken for two reasons. The first one is because of the translation problem that we mentioned before. What I found is that it's really easy to be misunderstood on either side. Something in written form that is parsable and understandable by the policymaker will go much, much farther than anything you can say at a conference on Twitter or somewhere else. And by the way, this is really painful because you actually need to write in a language that they can understand. On the flip side, this means that you will earn brownie points with them, and so they will actually be willing to listen to you. The second thing is that I think it's important to realize that almost always it's a negotiation process and you are negotiating from a position of weakness. So I can suggest two things. First, there is an awesome video by some Harvard professor that talks about negotiating from a position of weakness. I would strongly suggest you watch that. The second one is to understand what the other party wants. And it's a different answer based on their actual role. So are they like professional government employees? Are they politicians? What part of government? What side of the political spectrum? And so on and so forth. And there's homework that you absolutely need to do. the last thing I would say is that both Mara and Jeff mentioned this. So it's important to ask the right questions. At the same time, it's also and it's also important to scope down what you want the solution to be. In other words, if, for instance, we're talking about software liabilities, the answer, well, this is an undecidable problem because of the Alting problem, is not a good answer. So it is, and I know that on average it's somewhat hard to do that on our side because there is a lot of underlying details that you need to skip. But it's very important for the other side because otherwise it's not actionable. Nobody writes policies based on the Alting problem. So on the government side, so on the flip side, I think it's important for government to realize that they're not talking to the lawyers they're used to, they're not talking to the politicians they're used to, and so on and so forth. So there must be on their side also an effort to be willing to listen to a different sort of language, both in terms of actual language and also in the forms opinions are expressed. The other thing, which I know is wishful thinking, is I would wish for more honesty. Because, no, seriously, because if you tell me that your stake in this is I will not get my promotion unless this is passed, I don't care. I'm a technical person, I couldn't care less. So just tell me that, and it will help you get that promotion while at the same time not doing something stupid. I think there is important, and I think that is not something that happens at all. I've had multiple times people, assistants of politicians emailing me from their personal email account, essentially paraphrasing what the politician told me, and that is not a feasible way of dealing with these things. And I think, and the third thing is that at a fundamental level, I think that, and again, this is a fuzzier type of thing, but it would be really useful if government actually invested resources in understanding, in terms of information security, in actually understanding the landscape. Because I think this is something that we were talking about yesterday with a few people. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding going on about the fundamental issues, which bring all sorts of different problems in terms of what regulation is actually proposed.
Great, thanks. I'd also add the idea of responsiveness, that it's like dealing with the media. Sometimes they need an answer quickly. So if you turn around and give them a coherent answer quickly that they can understand, they're very appreciative. If you send it to them a week later, that you often miss the boat, the timing. Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. First hand there.
I noticed that this panel did not use the word crypto policy. Crypto policy. So I think that Rossonart is an example where you have to have a fairly open process.
Okay, so I'll try and briefly restate for the recording. So the question is, what about crypto policy? And are there basically two communities, inside the government having a classified high side discussion on the subject, and then everyone else having a discussion? Are the two actually communicating, and and to what extent is it going on inside or outside? So with that, to the panel.
So I have this other thing written down on my notepad, which I wanted to bring up, which is essentially a lot of this is these are all the opening salvos in what I consider the dual use war. Right? Technologies that were not sort of dual use are now dual use. And government doesn't know what to do about it. We don't know what to do about it. And so, for example, WASNAR is an arms control arrangement, essentially. It controls things like frequency hopping radios. It's like, well, I can program one of those things with my Raspberry Pi now. But in the 80s, that was a big deal. Nowadays, it's like a GNU radio, right? So how does that apply? I mean, I would argue that the frequency hopping radio part of Wassenaar doesn't make any sense anymore, yet it's still regulated, but it's software. For supply chain management, I think Apple devices, phones now, it used to be that they had to have like 8 SKUs because of the radios in them. And every version, they get better and better at having software-defined radio. So now there's like 4 SKUs, 3 SKUs. Well, at some point, there'll be just one phone. And the frequencies it talks on will be whatever it's programmed to do for that country. Well, that's a completely software-defined radio. That are cell phones now, prohibited. So we're moving into this area where you can't use normal compliance mechanisms. Right? How do you know that the person is not using that to defeat an arms control thing? And so it's happening in this crypto debate. Right? And you see Apple sort of at the forefront of it. I give them kudos for being so courageous. But these are like the tip of the spear kind of problems we're going to be dealing with for the next 15 years. And so that's why I think it's really important to take these lessons learned and start getting involved, because it's going to impact you one way or the other. If you don't think in 10 years software liability reform is going to come down the road, you're wrong. Right? The toaster will burn down the house, it will kill someone, and somebody will get sued, and the Internet of Things and the software shrink-wrap license is going to come under scrutiny from legislators or courts. And you as a software developer might want to think about that. Right? So it's not like this is a one-off or a two-off thing. And then to your point about, yes, the discussions are happening on the high side and the low side. And it's really interesting because it's kind of boiling down to law enforcement and not law enforcement.
So, question.
So, I'm Alan from the Department of Commerce. Can I borrow a mic for a minute to plug a chance to engage? People can do that. Okay?
Yeah. Okay, please.
Rocket. I hate to be one of those guys to hijack a panel, but if you are interested in engaging on a particular issue, another part of the Department of Commerce, just a floor above Randy's office, NTIA, is working on everyone's favorite old chestnut, vulnerability disclosure, trying to bring together researchers, vendors, across sectors, across different parts of the research ecosystem, to say, hey, if we can't actually demonstrate as a community that we can solve this, other parts of government are going to step in and solve it. And the Department of Commerce likes it when industry can handle things itself. So if you're interested, please come and find me and engage. And there are lots of other parts of government that are now really trying to work out and get more expertise from the InfoSec community. So find people who you know, talk to friends of friends. People do want to hear from you.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a good point. When people open up opportunities, we have to take advantage of them. And to go there in good faith and be participants, and they're staying in olive branch. Yes, question.
Considering that information security is some parts preventative and many parts reactionary, so there's a time factor in it, and information security is focused on being good at a thing and giving somebody how do you make communication and good communication, which takes
Okay, so basically you're saying that information security has preventative aspects, reactionary aspects, and information security practitioners are exceptionally busy. And how do they free up the time to engage policymakers?
Can I say something? If you care about job security, I don't know how you do it, but you need to find the time. Seriously, because a lot of this stuff, maybe not now, it might not be Wassenaar, it might not be vulnerability, sharing, whatnot, but eventually down the line, some piece of regulation will affect you directly. So no matter how annoying it is to actually be, it's to some extent involved in this, I think spending some of your spare time on this, and I know it's not a great solution, right? But I don't think, so to your point, I think that if you work for a big company, there is about zero chance that you will get the permission or time to focus on this. So it has to be on your spare time, I think.
So To add to that, there's a paper that I've been flogging to everyone that will listen called Cybersecurity at Civil Nuclear Facilities that was put out by Chatham House late last year. And this is a really extraordinary paper because the authors took 18 months to write it. It is an example of thinking slow in a very fast-moving field. They polled probably 30 of the smartest people in the world on both of those subjects who are just referred to by source, not by name. And one of the things you can do is try to find those resources that are, like Wilson Center does things like this. Try to find the people who are writing substantial overviews and retrospectives, and try to find a way to contribute maybe in that sense. So you don't necessarily need to be the pen yourself, but find the pen and talk to them.
Another question. Green shirt.
Guy behind green shirt also.
Okay. So briefly, the CISA rider bill, surprised a lot of people. What could be done differently, and suggestions from the panel? Or is that part of the gamesmanship of politics?
But I think there was a sort of inevitability. Something was going to happen, right? Ever since the 2012 Cybersecurity Act, it didn't happen. Even in the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, there was all this talk about information sharing. So information sharing took hold before 2012, and it was sort of pitched as this panacea. Least invasive, everybody likes sharing information, we're going to be government, we're going to get government out of the way, we'll help accelerate sharing, and that's a good thing. How can that be bad? And so ever since 2012, at least, it just keeps coming up, and they won't let it go. And it's hard to say you're against sharing. And so there was this inevitability. It was going to happen one way or the other. People needed to claim that they did some sort of positive legislation, and who's against information sharing? And so it sort of became the perfect meme. And then, like you said, in the conference committee kind of got changed. But it was a pretty well-crafted meme that you couldn't stand in front of.
Okay, so last question. Black shirt behind green shirt. Your hand's been raised for a while, sir. Yeah. Okay, so for the recording, what's the relationship of politics and policy? And I'll take a little bit of liberty and say, how do hackers hack this complex system effectively? To what end? Okay.
We spent a fair bit of time talking yesterday about trying to establish objectives and end states, and those really are unanswered questions on both sides. Generally speaking, when government is, when most of the motions that are currently occurring within government to undertake regulation or policy in this space, the end state or the objective they're on a spectrum from fuzzy to unknown. But we're not doing that much better on this side. So, right now it's very much defense, and there is, one imminent threat that is being dealt with, and, a bunch more coming down the pike. But the question of what we want ultimately to result from each of these interventions is one that we're not very good at answering yet.
One thing I would add is that I think so far InfoSec-related problems are not polarizing enough yet from a political standpoint, which is an opportunity, in the sense that there aren't clear defined right-wing or left-wing positions on cyber matters, which is an advantage for us. That being said, what I was saying before is that everyone you talk to has some kind of agenda, and you are in a position of weakness. And after a while, it's actually pretty easy to figure out what the other party wants. What I found really hard is to understand the relationship between maybe the political part and the policy counterpart. But to a great extent, that is not something you should be concerned about, as long as you can have conversations with both, and then eventually you will triangulate what's going on and see who has the upper end, which, depending on the institution you're dealing with, is really complicated. One very quick thing. For instance, what I was saying before about the European Union, the reality is that the European Parliament is the body that actually approves the budget for the European Commission. At the same time, the European Commission is the one that drafts the regulation or the legislation. So there is a carefully crafted balance there, and sort of like in the details of that balance, sort of like you'll find the key to who's more important in the conversation. I think the same applies to the US, but with very different mechanisms that I'm not particularly familiar with.
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and use that 1 minute to thank our speakers. And thank you all for coming.
Perfect.
Good. So they let us run a little.
Survived. Unscathed.
Okay. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Was it okay? Good job.
It's good.
Hey, cheers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, hey, man. Oh,